Hello, and welcome to this CNBC special report on the president's big tax and spending plan that has now passed the House and Senate and been signed into law. Our focus is on you and who will really feel the impact, from schools to state and local taxes, from university endowments to new donor incentives that might surprise even veterans of charitable giving. The new spending law changes how Americans pay for education at every level. One provision affects school vouchers with a possible ripple effect on public school funding. Another targets large university endowments, bringing a new tax reality to higher education. Our Sharon Epperson has both sides of the story, starting with the impact on those school vouchers. Sharon.
Well, John, under the law, individual taxpayers will be eligible for tax credits for donations that they make to organizations that award scholarships for private school students in kindergarten through 12th grade. Starting in 2027, the tax credit would fully reimburse donors up to $1,700 for contributions they give to groups that provide scholarships to attend private school. Students with family income of no more than 300% of their area's median gross income are eligible for the scholarships. Now, states and districts can choose whether to opt into the program. Currently, 30 states and Washington, D.C. have at least one private school choice program. The new legislation sets up the potential for a new round of battles at the state and local level over school choice. There's no cap on the number of tax credits that could be issued, making it hard to calculate the cost. The Joint Committee on Taxation estimates the credits will cost nearly $26 billion over 10 years, while the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy estimates if all eligible taxpayers claim the tax credit, it would cost over $100 billion a year. Now, the biggest factor in the cost calculation is how successful private schools and their backers are at getting people to contribute.
Now, Sharon, talking about the elements here of this new reality in the law around these donations to voucher scholarships, a tax credit, very different from a tax deduction, right?
A tax credit is very different from a tax deduction. A tax credit will lower your taxable income dollar for dollar, and that's what makes tax credits more attractive to most taxpayers than a deduction.
And so also there's a concern about the effect here to private schools. One could argue that there's an effect on public schools in that if you want to support a booster club or give money that affects positively the public school, you don't get that same dollar for dollar benefit in taxes, right?
Absolutely. Talking to teachers' unions and presidents there, they are very concerned about money not going to public schools, impacting the education they're able to provide there to each and every student, and particularly how this may impact students with disabilities, students who are disadvantaged in some ways in terms of getting special programs for them in the public school system. Now, will they have the funding to be able to do this? That is a big concern.
Now, we talked about the individual side. If you make within 4 times the median income for your area, you're eligible for this credit if you donate to this. Now, for businesses, though, it's different. There's the potential to donate even more dollar-wise.
Well, this is what we're looking at, whether or not we're going to see businesses and wealthy donors giving more to support these choice programs, these voucher programs. That is going to be a significant factor on how successful this is going to be.
All right. Well, Sharon, another big part of all this is university endowments. They'll be under new pressure. You're also reporting on what the new tax rules will mean for higher education?
Absolutely. You know, when we look at what U.S. colleges and universities held in 2023, more than $900 billion in total investable assets is what they held at the end of that fiscal year. The government wanted a bigger slice of those funds, but it won't quite get as much as first proposed. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act imposed a 1.4% tax on endowments. That rate will remain the same for smaller endowments, but now for endowments between $750,000 and $2 million, the rate will increase to 4%. And the rate for endowments over $2 million is now set at 8%, nearly quadruple the prior rate. However, schools with fewer than 3,000 tuition-paying students are exempt, regardless of their endowment size. The tax increase will impact some of the top research universities in the country. Experts say the higher tax will hit about 15 schools. In 2023, 56 universities paid about $380 million under the endowment tax. The Joint Committee on Taxation figures this endowment tax will now bring in $761 million over 10 years. Now, the amount the Treasury could collect from the tax also depends on how much endowments earn and if tax changes and donor behavior or how the endowments invest changes as well. Experts say the amount the U.S. Treasury gets could be smaller if colleges and universities shift their endowment strategy to avoid a severe tax hit. They could do this by shifting from dividend-paying assets to non-dividend alternatives or offering more scholarships to reduce the number of tuition-paying students to less than 3,000.
Wow, Sharon, those are some big changes for endowments that are largely used often to pay for scholarships. What's sort of the calculation that's been used here to determine whether schools have the kind of excess funding that needs to be taxed? Does it have to do with how much money they have in those endowments relative to how many students they have, or how does that work?
It is relative to how many students they have, and so that's the key factor in determining this. And again, schools that have a smaller number of students are going to be exempt altogether. So we're talking about schools like Amherst and Wellesley, and they do have significant endowments, but they have a small number of students. So when you look at this, what the universities are doing right now is they're doing damage control. They're trying to figure out how they can stop hiring for 3 months or so, cut spending budgets by 5% or so, trying to make sure that they're prepared for what they anticipate is going to be a significant budget shortfall. It's still, many of the universities are saying, will not be enough.
So not to get into too much of the weeds here, but there are also some changes in this legislation that's been passed to federal support for student loans. How is that going to shift the terms under which students who need loans, perhaps they don't qualify for total need-based aid, maybe they just need loans, the sorts of terms that they might get if they're not federally backed in the same way?
Well, we're looking at the federal changes and also just the fact that we're seeing significant cuts as well to major institutions like the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation that provide research dollars and then allow schools to provide scholarship aid to students working in those areas. We're going to see a significant impact on students that require financial aid in terms of their education, and that could change what we see in terms of the demographics of many of these schools.
Now, on the flip side, is there the argument to be made that it was the federal loan amounts were actually pushing the inflation in tuition, and maybe by making that less available, it'll reduce the incentive that schools have to raise the ticket price and stop that tuition inflation thing that we've certainly been seeing for the past couple decades?
That certainly has been one of the arguments, but again, we're looking at many students who will need this aid, and they are getting it because the universities have significant endowments and can provide need-blind assistance and make sure that that continues to happen. It's going to be very important for these schools to have the funds to do so. They're concerned that they may not.
Really important for so many of the nation's youth that need to be prepared for the workforce. Sharon Epperson, great work. Thank you.
Sure.
While the president's spending and tax law changes the long-debated SALT, state and local tax deduction, giving taxpayers in high-tax states a bit of a win, at least for now, rules around charitable giving are also changing in a way that could be surprising. CNBC's wealth reporter Robert Frank here with me. Both stories, starting with state and local taxes. Robert.
Yeah, and this SALT thing, that was the lightning rod. You know, it started in the House with a big battle there, went to the Senate. Where did we end up? Well, for high earners in high-tax states, there was some relief on the SALT cap, but it's not going to last for long. That's because state and local tax deductions, you might remember, they were capped at $10,000 as part of that 2017 tax cuts. After a big backlash from the blue state Republicans, Congress agreed to increase the cap to $40,000. That cap will increase 1% a year. That's to kind of adjust for inflation. Now, there are two caveats here. First, the cap phases out if you have income of more than $500,000 a year, and the higher cap expires after 2029. So in 5 years, it all goes back to $10,000 for all those earners, no matter how much you make. Now, the Senate also preserved a popular loophole that was used or is used to get around the cap. So dozens of states allow taxpayers to take a full tax SALT deduction through pass-through entities. So the House closed that loophole. They said, can't do it anymore. The Senate, in the final version, removed any restrictions. So if you're a partner in a law firm, accounting firm, doctor, dentist, you don't have to pay SALT anymore. You can get that full deduction. Now, all of that expected to add around $300 billion to the cost of the bill. And that was why it was so controversial, because they said, look, it's a gift to the wealthy. It's going to add to the cost of a bill that was already very expensive. I was pretty surprised, given that there aren't any sort of blue state Republican senators, that they agreed to it, but they were facing such strong backlash in the House that they had to move it.
Now, Robert, this is a classic American money culture story in my mind, because it's a case where everybody thinks they're middle class, maybe upper middle class, but very few people, unless you're a billionaire, very few people think they're rich, especially on the coast. You're talking about New York, LA, et cetera. And so the argument against doing this and increasing the SALT cap was, boy, if you're taking $40,000 in a deduction, you're rich. But a lot of people would argue, hey, just to buy a house in the New York area, you're paying a ton of money, and you got people, two-earner households stretching to do that. They don't feel rich.
Yeah, anyone living in parts of California, in the tri-state area of New York, just the property taxes alone bring you a long way to that $40,000. But even as a wealth reporter, I would admit that $500,000 is a cap. You're doing pretty well at $500,000 a year. And so that was a level that I think everyone agreed on. You're doing pretty well. There are not many firefighters or cops or anything that, this was the Democratic argument. Well, firefighters in Manhattan are getting hit with SALT. I think that exempts most people. And the 40K is a decent number. It may not help everybody who's sort of upper middle class, but I think it helps those who really needed it. And it still doesn't really help the multi-billionaire, the ultra wealthy, who could deduct hundreds of thousands or even millions a year.
Part of the philosophy of these changes to how we do taxes, to how we do spending, seems to be, boy, there is entitlement spending, and once people get that, they view it as just belonging to them.
Yeah.
But tax cuts are temporary. The shift seems to be, no, let's make the tax cuts permanent. People expect, once you get that benefit, you expect to keep it. Do you think this SALT thing is really going to roll back in 5 years?
Here's what people forgot is that when we did this in 2017, they proposed the SALT thing, and they said we're going to cap it at $10,000. There was so much pushback from Trump's wealthy friends that at a dinner in New York, he got just screamed at. So what he said is, okay, the top rate is going to go from 39.6 to 37%. So problem solved, everybody was happy. They forgot that was the compromise. Now we're keeping the top rate at 37%, and we're raising it. So they forgot, okay, what they should have done is say, okay, we'll give you $40,000 on the cap, but we're going to raise the top rate to 38% because that was the deal. So you're right. When they get a tax gift, in their minds, it becomes permanent. They forgot what the give and take here was.
But to me,
so it all becomes more and more and more expensive.
That's what I'm trying to drill down to, is this idea that once we get a tax cut, now we expect it to be permanent. That's part of the mind shift here with the Trump administration, the control of the House and the Senate. And it's kind of a conservative bedrock principle, is that once government gets your tax money, they feel entitled to it. And they're trying to reverse that idea, right?
No, you're right. And that's exactly how it does work. The accounting process in D.C. and the magic math of D.C. is that, well, it's going to expire in How do you really think that this $40,000 cap is going to go back to $10,000 in 2030, or we're going to have another battle? Just like guarantee we're going to have another battle. So you're right. To the populace and to voters, these things are permanent. You can't take them away, otherwise it's a tax increase. But for the accounting purposes, both in 2017 and now, they're all temporary, and they're all going to go back. It's never going to go back.
But the math keeps not mathing. It's not working. So eventually we're going to have to, you're going to have to deal with that.
Yeah.
Well, another big part of all of this, when we're talking about this law that has passed, charitable giving rules are changing to allow bigger deductions for smaller givers. Robert, how does this work?
Well, if you look at the world of philanthropy, this is going to be a lot of big changes. So overall, charitable giving increased to a record $590 billion last year, mainly driven by all that stock market wealth that we had. The tax changes, however, in this big, beautiful bill, now become law, could cause a big shift in who gives and how much. So let's take a look. It allows new charitable deductions for those who take the standard deduction and they don't itemize. That's about 90% of Americans. That deduction will be up to $1,000 for individuals and $2,000 for married couple. That is brand new. Now, to pay for that, it requires itemizers, i.e. the wealthy, to exempt from their charitable deduction the first 0.5% of their gross income. So if you're lucky enough to make $1 million a year, your first $5,000 given to charity cannot be deducted at all. It also limits deductions for those in the top tax bracket, allowing them to claim only a 35% tax deduction for their charitable gifts rather than the 37%. Now, supporters say all these changes will encourage more giving by everyday Americans, which we need. Others estimate that because it's going to reduce giving by the top, and those are the folks who, let's face it, give the most these days, those changes are going to reduce giving by more than $8 billion a year. So we're going to see where this shakes out.
So, Robert, there's most of us. There's the top, and then there's the tippy top.
Yeah.
It seems to me like the tippy top isn't affected by this. Like if you have a big salary, right, and you maybe have a donor advised fund and you give through that, and maybe you tithe to your church, this affects you. But if you got a foundation, right, does it really affect you that much?
No, the Bill Gates, the Warren Buffetts, the big philanthropists of the world, this is not going to change that. But most giving is done by the sort of everyday wealthy who give to, hospitals and churches and schools. And it's not going to stop their giving, but you're reducing the incentive and the tax benefit of giving around the margins for them. Now, what happened in 2017, unintended consequence, was you had this phenomenon, what's known as dollars up, donors down. The middle class and the everyday Americans stopped giving because there was no longer a tax benefit. So, but the good thing was that all of that and more was replaced by giving by the very wealthy. Now the question is, how tax sensitive are wealthy donors? We all like to think the wealthy give because they want to make the world a better place and solve social problems. They also do it for tax reasons. And I think it'll obviously all depends on how the markets do this year. That drives philanthropy. But I think what does it send? What kind of message does it send as a country that we're saying, you know what? One of the things we don't value as much is philanthropy by the wealthy.
Unless you want to give to a school voucher.
Unless you want to give to a school voucher.
Because that $1,700
exactly,
is pretty much equivalent to the deduction that you would get on that first $5,000, isn't it?
Well, it's $1,700. Well, yeah, because one is a full tax credit and the other one's a reduction. Yeah, it could.
I mean, if you do the percentages,
almost offset.
Right, it's like 30-something percent.
There depends on sort of where you give, how much you make, how you give, and so all this. One of the things overarching with this tax bill is everyone's like, well, how does it affect me? It all depends on how you make your money, how much you make, how you spend it, and where you give it, and all those factors are very individual because this is a very complex bill. But you're right. If you give to schools, you could actually get a benefit.
So if you give more than $5,000,
yeah.
If you give more in the realm of $10,000, $15,000,
then the rest of that is deductible, but at a lower rate, you only get a 35%, 35 cents per dollar deducted versus 37%. Again, it's not huge, especially if you're wealthy. But again, part of the tax code is designed to tell us what behavior we want to reward and what behavior we want to reduce. And this tells us that we want to reduce giving by the wealthy because we want to increase it by the middle class. Now, the question, will the middle class, which is so strapped right now, trying to pay for college, trying to pay for food, trying to pay for, health care, all the things that are they going to pay up based on this deduction that they're now going to get? We'll see. That's going to be the big question.
So does a charity then have to go after the super wealthy? Do they then instead go after legacy gifts as more of a focus, right? They've got to make some adjustment in strategy to try to make up for the reduction in this pool of the everyday wealthy and their reduced incentive to give.
You just crystallized the debate going on in every boardroom of every nonprofit right now, exactly that question. So do we return to our roots, which is for years people chased smaller deductions by more Americans, or do we just focus on a smaller number of ultra wealthy who are going to give us multi-million-dollar gifts? They've been chasing the top. Now the question is, do they go back, or they say, you know what, that's not going to happen. We'll just focus on that's the debate, and no one knows the answer.
You crystallized it for us, Robert Frank. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Maya McGinnis is president of the Bipartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. She's a leading expert on taxes and spending. and is with us now to talk about the impact of this bill that has become law and has some pretty big shifts in who's paying for what and what happens to the deficit here. Maya, welcome. First of all, the Trump administration and a lot of Republicans arguing that the calculation here that says this adds to the deficit, that's wrong, because really these tax cuts, we should have assumed that they would be permanent from the beginning. What do you say to that?
So you have to decide either at the beginning or when you're extending tax cuts, whether you mean them to be permanent or whether you mean them to be temporary. When this tax bill was created, many of these tax cuts expired to bring the price tag of the bill down. It was a way to keep it within the most amount that you were allowed to borrow. And so they assumed and put into law that many of these tax cuts would expire, and the bill was correspondingly lower. So then you come to the point when you're extending them, because of course the purpose was they always should have in their minds been permanent, and you say, we don't have to pay for it because we always meant for it to be the case. I think the irony of this, and what really demonstrates how disingenuous that argument is that at the same time in this new tax bill, there are a number of new tax cuts on tips and overtime and other things, all of which would expire and all of which they don't assume are permanent when it comes to costing them out. So the bottom line is, if you're going to add, say, $4 trillion in borrowing, you either need to recognize it when you create the tax bill or when you extend the tax bill, but you can't switch how you account for it in the beginning and at the extension time and then pretend it's free. And that's basically what the claim has been. It's not going to fool the bond market.
Yeah, and so the bond market aside for a moment, just going back to our family pocketbooks and the nation's pocketbook, if we start to assume that every temporary tax cut or tax credit becomes permanent, what does that do to what we need to do to entitlement programs and the social safety net in order to eventually get solvent here and get our fiscal house in order as a nation?
Well, that's a great point, because if we were in the beginning assuming that all policies put in place are permanent, and maybe you would take out things like emergency spending, we would know that that's the assumption, that's what we are putting into place. And I think there's talk about making those changes. We would have then understood all along that the fiscal gap, the amount we will be borrowing over the coming decade, would have been $4 trillion or a little bit more higher than people were already saying. That puts more pressure on the overall budget than the smaller numbers that were being built into the projections. Either way, one thing we know for sure is we have to fix our Social Security and Medicare programs. Both of these are projected to become insolvent in less than a decade, in roughly 8 years. It is perhaps the most reckless thing we could be doing for seniors, particularly those who depend on these programs, to know that they are headed towards insolvency and to continue year after year not to make the changes that we are required to in order to pay the benefits that are legally owed.
Well,
what happens when the trust fund runs out of money, you can't pay more than dollars than the trust fund has, and that's what we're headed towards.
Well, it's kind of a political booby trap, right, that's been built into the system now. If a hot potato, if we're being a little bit more kind, where each group in power seems to be tossing it to the next one to say, okay, well, you're going to have to be the one that raises taxes, which is politically, unwise, and therefore you're going to get voted out for doing that because people don't like their taxes raised. We're going to give them the candy now. You got to give them the broccoli later. Isn't that what we've set up here? You're arguing with this bill that's now become law?
Unfortunately, that's exactly what is happening here. You have two parties who now have become cynical enough that they are putting ahead of the overall good of the country, keep your debt at reasonable levels, fix Social Security and Medicare when they're warning signs. Instead, they've put ahead the idea that if you give taxpayers what they want in tax cuts or spending increases, it will be good for you politically, and let somebody else figure it out. And unfortunately, the reality is they're probably right from a political perspective. Incredibly damaging, though, to the country in terms of the economy, our long-term well-being, and these programs that people depend on. And if we have two parties that are working against each other instead of for the country, we're left incredibly vulnerable from a fiscal perspective. That's exactly where we are right now. And this bill makes it worse on a number of fronts.
Well, now let's bring in the bond market. This sounds like the person who we all know, and frankly, if we're admitting it, who some of us are, paying the minimum balance on a credit card and just sort of like letting that roll over into the future, deal with it later. What's so bad about that on a national economy level?
Yeah, and it was particularly easy to make that argument, and many people have, when interest rates were so low. Look, we can borrow, rates are low, we'll pay the interest. If we just grow our way a little bit faster than the cost of borrowing, we'll be fine. The problem is you can never count on these things in an ongoing way, as we saw when we had huge, very high levels of inflation and spikes in interest rates over the past months and years. We are very vulnerable at this point because we have borrowed so much to any changes in the overall macroeconomy. And if
Right.
things get worse, and given all the demand that we are going, the need that we're going to have selling treasuries, it is quite likely that they could and will get worse. Then our interest payments start to grow really quickly. There's already the fastest growing part of the budget. It could get worse.
So back in credit card terms, right, when rates get high and stay high, your minimum payment as a country goes up, and then there's less money in the budget to spend on, bacon, defense, right? Important things.
You got it. The interest payments are the very first claim on the budgetary dollars. Whether you want tax cuts or big new spending programs, interest is going to get those dollars first, and we're going to have a smaller pie to fight about the other priorities.
So what do we do?
The list is long, and it's well known. In fact, we have to fix Social Security. We need to look at retirement age, means testing, lifting the payroll tax cap. We have to fix Medicare and our healthcare programs. There are a number of policies out there. Just start with site neutral, paying the same amount for wherever you get your procedures done. Number of bipartisan healthcare benefits we need to look at. We need to put discretionary caps back in. They're expiring at the end of this year. We need to be realistic about what our defense spending is going to be. If it has to go up, we need to find savings elsewhere, like in spending procurement. And we will need higher revenues. And a lot of people are saying, don't worry, this tax cut will generate revenues that are higher, it will pay for itself. Realistically, that won't happen. You can't sustain that over a decade. We need to look at broadening our tax base, whether we need some new form of taxation. We lose $20 trillion over a decade, by the way, in tax breaks. We could just limit those, and that could be good for the overall affordability of the things we try to subsidize, but it backfires and makes them more expensive and generate more revenue. But what we really need to do is get serious, have the two parties start cooperating instead of trying to out-pander each other, and be more realistic with voters that when you have a debt as large as ours at near record levels, we're going to have to start passing budgets and making some real choices. And the path we're on is going to harm us if we don't change course relatively quickly.
Taxes going to have to go up?
They will. They will. And entitlements will have to be fixed. And the problem is we have parties that aren't being honest enough about those kind of choices that we have to confront.
All right. Hamburgers on the couch electorate and economy going to have to get excited about CrossFit and nutrition. I don't know how it's going to happen, but you've laid it out for us, Maya McGinnis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that does it for now on our special report about the president's spending and tax plan and its impact on you. That's from school vouchers to university endowments to the state and local tax deduction and new rules on those big university endowments. The impact is going to be felt from classrooms to your next tax return. We will stay on it here at CNBC. And for CNBC, I'm John Ford.